stand up, would you please stand up in the witness box and not move? We're getting some reflection. And one of the reporters thought that the juror was pictured, but it wasn't. We looked at it, and I think it was the court reporter.
Okay.
Okay.
What is up, everyone? Please take a second to hit that like button. The more likes that we get in a short period of time, the more people the algorithm will bring into the chat to come hang out with us and see what's going on. So please hit that like button and let me know how you're doing.
Morning, Sergeant Peterson.
Morning.
My name is Paul Lang. We met once before. I have some questions for you on behalf of former Officer Potter.
Okay.
You started your testimony yesterday by discussing why you became a trainer.
Yes.
And one of the reasons you mentioned yesterday was that you wanted to be safe.
Correct.
Safe meaning your own safety, correct?
Mine and that of my partners.
And you wanted your fellow officers on the street to be safe.
Yes.
And you also wanted to be wanted the community to be safe that you serve.
Yes.
Okay. And specifically, you've trained officers so that you can trust what they do in times of need, your need, the needs of other officers as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
You're training them to make a split-second decision
Yes.
in what can be very dangerous circumstances.
Yes.
Okay? And you're training them to, if you were at risk, that you would want them to be making an instant decision on your behalf. Is that correct?
Can you repeat?
You'd want them to make the right decision for you if you were in harm's way, right?
Correct.
Which is a key motivation for you.
Yes.
And the purpose of training is many things, but one of the reasons you train is that police work is risky.
Correct.
You're dealing with a public that sometimes can be very dangerous,
Yes.
can be armed,
Yes.
and can be unpredictable in their behaviors.
Yes.
And there is a need then to react quickly to what an officer sees. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what you train in an omnibus way is for them to be to have the tools they need to respond. Is that correct?
Correct.
To respond quickly,
Yes.
and then you leave them with a certain amount of discretion to make that decision depending on individual circumstances. Okay?
Absolutely.
Now, Officer Potter attended your classes that you've described. Is that correct?
She has.
She was an attentive student, right?
Yes.
She fully participated in all your scenarios. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. She didn't miss any of your classes or skip out.
If she missed them, she wouldn't have been on a roster,
Right, but-
and then she would have had to make up that training.
Yeah, but if she's on your roster, she attended.
Correct.
And you knew that she was an FTO, is that correct?
I did.
And an FTO is a field training officer,
Yes.
and the field training officer on the street has a number of duties, is that correct?
Yes.
And there are a lot of things. There are a lot more things going on for a field training officer than just an officer on the street ordinarily. Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, you have this is obvious to you, but you have supervisory capacities, right?
As a field training officer, you certainly do.
You have the evaluation capacities, right?
Yes.
And all of a sudden, you have two officers on the street thinking perhaps different things.
Correct.
Now, this Taser 7 that we've talked about, this was a new product, was it not?
For our department, yes.
And it just came out. You just bought some, right?
Yeah, we had just purchased them in the beginning of 2020.
Okay. And,
I'm sorry, 2021.
2021. You have no evidence that she ever used the taser in the field, do you? You'd certainly know about it if she did.
I would know about it if she did, yes.
And you have no evidence that she did, right?
No.
Okay. But these new tasers were in working order.
They were?
And I assume they're like every other new product. There are certain advancements or improvements compared to the old product, right?
That's the reason we would have gone to a new product.
And would it be fair to say that the battery capacity of the new taser would be at least similar or better than the older taser in play? Is that correct?
Better.
And the battery capacity lasts a while, does it not?
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't need to be charged every day,
It does not have to be, no.
especially if it's not used. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the last training that she received on the Taser 7 was on March 2nd,
I believe so. That was the date that she was there.
but she didn't get her gun until later in March, like the 26th, according to the records.
Do you mean a taser?
Yeah, the Taser, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It wasn't until a little bit later that month that we were actually able to deploy the tasers to the field.
She was the first one to get it, right?
One of a group, I believe.
And by contrast to the new Taser, the firearm that she had was a semi-automatic,
Correct?
a Glock.
Yes.
And that Glock has been around the police world in which you have it for decades now. Is that correct?
The product has been around for a really long time. That specific one, we had changed out to a new fleet of handguns in 2012, I think it was.
Okay. So she'd had that gun for almost 10 years.
Around that,
And
yeah.
it was the same kind of gun.
Similar
I
in
mean, it's
function,
not
yes.
an electronic gun. It's just a handgun. I don't say just a handgun. It's a handgun that's built similarly for the last decades, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, they used this kind of mechanism in World War II.
Yes.
And that was the Glock, or a similar gun to the Glock that she had been trained on repeatedly by you and by the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's the Glock that she had on this person that she went to the firing range on a regular basis. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did all the other trainings that you had with her. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the training that you have in tasers is such that you try to get close to what it's like in real life to use them and what the officers face. Is that correct?
As close as we can in the training session, yes.
But you never can quite reach that level, of course, right?
Never will be able to.
Okay. So you do the best you can do.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, you can't, for example, replicate a car taking off.
That would not be safe in a training environment.
You can't replicate an officer who is inside a car that might take off. Is that correct?
Not practically. In talking about it, we do, but not.
But you'd never put someone in harm's way during training, obviously, right?
No.
Okay. And you know from your training, you tell the officers that every response by the individual officer will be unique, right?
Can you say that again?
Every officer will respond in a unique way to the training. Is that right?
Correct.
I mean, everyone has different blood pressures that go up, right?
Yes.
Everyone has different reactions to adrenaline.
Correct.
And officers see different things at different times during your training exercises, right?
Absolutely.
And even during all your training, you recognize that certain officers take different routes and exercise discretion differently. Is that right?
Correct.
And there may not be any one right answer. Correct. In fact, some of your training exercises are designed so there may not be a right answer.
Yes.
And lately with COVID, it's been difficult to have in-person trainings. I think you mentioned that yesterday.
It has been extremely difficult.
I mean, you used to use volunteers, as I understand it, strangers, so that the officers wouldn't know who they are, right?
Not strangers, but civilians in our department.
Okay. But that's not really possible nowadays.
We're getting a little more back to normal, but still not where we were 2 years ago.
But even earlier this year, it wasn't advisable.
No.
Okay. And that's why you had a training session on March 2nd involving you as a subject, because it was the safest thing to do in light of COVID and the restrictions you were under. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you talked about scenario training yesterday.
Yes.
Scenario training would be where the officers are required to react to a certain situation where there's a person. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you yourself on March 2nd created 2 scenarios where the officers would react. Is that right?
I did.
Okay. And it's the only training on a scenario that was given for the Taser 7. Am I right about that?
Can you rephrase?
Was March 2nd the only training given on the Taser 7?
Yes.
Okay. So you were the person who was acting in such a way that would provoke a police officer to decide to do something, right?
During the scenarios, yes.
And I think one of them was you came out of a closet or some doorway with a club in your hand. Am I right about that?
It was a bat.
It was a bat. And then you motioned the bat towards the officer and they had to decide what to do, right?
Correct.
Whether it be a taser or a gun, right?
Or any of their other tools that they had on their person.
Okay. And some of the officers shot you with a taser.
Some did.
Some shot you with a gun.
None shot me with a gun.
Okay. But in any event, the exercise was the best you could do, but the officers knew who you were,
They did.
and a lot of them are friends of yours.
Yes.
It's a tight-knit department,
Very.
and they knew that you weren't going to try to kill them.
Yeah.
They knew you weren't going to take flight.
Yes.
They knew you weren't high.
Correct.
They knew you didn't have a bench warrant.
Correct.
They knew you didn't have a gun.
A real gun, yes.
And they knew you didn't have an access to the gun around your person.
Correct.
And they knew that you weren't going to use a gun. Real gun.
Yes. Okay.
And they knew you weren't going to hurt them.
Correct.
Now, one of the things you do in training is talk about the policies of your department. Is that right?
Some of the policies, not all.
And yesterday we talked about the Taser policy, which is number 304.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't think I need to show it on the screen, but I do want to ask you some questions about it. That was Exhibit 334.
Okay.
Okay. And you've almost memorized this, haven't you, over the years?
Not verbatim, but I have a general idea how to put it in practice.
I mean, you've talked about this hundreds of times.
Yes.
And the early part of the policy is at 304.3, and it says the officer shall, the verb is shall, only use a Taser device that has been issued by the department, right?
Correct.
Okay. So you want to control what they use. They can't buy their own.
Correct.
And then also in that section it says the officer shall carry the Taser device on the reaction side. Is that right?
Correct.
And then in the middle, we've had a discussion here. It said, members, quote, members carrying the Taser should perform a spark test on the unit prior to every shift. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. A should is the verb, and it differs from shall as a verb, right?
Yes.
Okay. And should is an aspirational verb. In other words, you encourage the officers to test and do a spark test before every shift, right?
Correct.
It doesn't always happen.
It does not.
And there are a lot of things going on. In fact, we have testimony that on 4 of 6 shifts it didn't happen with Officer Potter, right?
Correct.
And it hasn't happened with other officers too.
Correct.
And you're not, she was never reprimanded, or you never talked to her, for example, about, well, do a spark test. You missed a couple, I assume.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, I mean, did you ever talk to her about missing a couple spark tests?
No.
I mean, that's not something you usually talk to the officers about.
No.
Okay. And the fact of the matter is the machine worked. I mean, the gun worked. The Taser worked, right?
Yes.
Okay. And also in this section 304, you talk about verbal warnings that must be given to the the subject who may be tased, is that correct?
Yes.
And the idea here in the policy is the individual should be warned, if possible, that a taser may be employed. Is that correct?
Correct.
In fact, it says a verbal warning of the intended use should precede its application, right?
Correct.
It doesn't say shall, it doesn't say required, right?
Correct.
And the reason you do a warning, you teach everyone, including former Officer Potter, is that you want to provide the individual with notice that something may be happening, right?
Yes.
I mean, you've been tased, it's painful.
It is.
You don't want to repeat it.
Correct.
It's designed to disable you.
Yes.
And even a big guy like you were disabled temporarily.
Yes.
So the reason you give a warning is to provide the individual with an opportunity to comply, right?
Correct.
I mean, the hope is that they will.
Always is the hope.
And then you want to provide a warning that it may indeed be deployed. Is that correct?
Yes.
So a typical warning that you teach is, "I'll tase you. I'll tase you."
Correct.
And it's said in a vocal, loud way, so the subject will understand what you're talking about, right?
In plain English, yes.
So it's consistent when someone's going to use a taser to say, "I'll tase you. I'll tase you."
Yes.
That's what the department wants someone to do.
It's one of the many things that we teach them to say.
And then there's a section on application of the taser, 304.5.1, that permits the use of the taser or suggests the taser can be used, right?
Yes.
Under certain circumstances.
Yes.
And one of the circumstances is if the subject is violent
Yes.
or is physically resisting.
Yes.
I mean, if someone is resisting a cuffing and attempts to get back into a car, for example, that person can be tased.
Yes.
Or you can also tase, according to your policy, not you, but an officer that you train, if the subject has demonstrated by words or action an intention to be violent. Correct?
Correct.
Or to physically resist. Right?
Yes.
Or if that person is a potential harm to others.
Yes.
So all those factors can be considered
Yes.
in employing the taser.
In a very short amount of time.
In fact, the decision I'm glad you mentioned that the decision to use a taser is really quick.
The decision to use any.
The objection? Well, I'll let the answer stand. You can finish what you were going to say.
Any use of force has to be made in a very short amount of time.
But what you don't want to use a taser if someone's physically running away from you necessarily.
Necessarily, but it's not an absolute no.
Okay. And you don't want to use a taser if a car is moving.
Correct, moving.
But if a car, on the other hand, is stationary.
We've used it many times on people inside vehicles that are stationary.
And one of the things you teach is whether the individual has, quote unquote, control over the motor vehicle, right?
Yes.
And the rule that you teach, I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that if the individual doesn't have control over the car, the taser would be appropriate.
It certainly could be depending on the circumstances.
And again, you rely on the officer's discretion to make that decision.
Yes.
Now, we also heard a lot of testimony about taser warnings. One of the warnings was in Exhibit 270. You recognize this kind of thing, don't you?
Yes.
You've seen this dozens of times.
Yes.
And this is a warning that's issued by the taser manufacturer, as I understand it.
Correct.
It's made by Axon, is that right?
Yeah, that is the company that distributes the Taser products.
And they warn about all sorts of things that can go wrong when you're using a Taser.
Lots of things.
And this purpose of this warning that you showed us yesterday is to have the person undergoing training release the Taser company from liability in case something goes wrong during training using the Taser.
That specific document?
Not this specific one, but in general, that's why they sign these releases, right?
That's why they sign the training form that I then sign later certifying that they can carry a Taser.
So the training form not only recognizes their completion of treatment, but releases the Taser company from liability during the training.
Correct.
And one of the warnings of this document, 270, that we saw is that there can be a confusion between a Taser and a handgun.
Yes.
And there is a recognition thus by the company that makes these things that there can indeed be a confusion between the two.
Yes.
Otherwise, why warn you, right?
Right.
And there have been confusions between Tasers and guns
Several.
across the country.
Yes.
And in fact, the Taser is shaped, at least on a handle basis, like a gun, right?
It is?
It has a trigger, right?
Yes.
The handle may be smaller, but it's
Yes.
still a gun handle,
To fit into a hand, correct.
especially a smaller hand.
Any hand.
And one of the reasons the Taser manufacturer releases or wants all these releases is that they know, and you know from training, that mistakes can happen.
Correct.
Mistakes can happen during training when someone is trying to use a Taser.
Yes.
And mistakes can happen when someone confuses a Taser with a gun.
Correct.
And it can be an innocent mistake.
Certainly can be.
The objection is sustained. And the answer, the jury will disregard that asked question and answer.
And in every training exercise you do, there are these release and warning requirements. This is Exhibit 369 from yesterday. Do you see this? You recognize this, don't you?
I recognize it, yes.
I mean, this is it's a training and warning requirement that is insisted upon by Taser, the Axum Enterprises that makes it, right?
Correct.
In fact, you are constrained during training to do exactly what Taser wants you to do.
Exactly what they want us to do.
And that's a precondition of even owning or using the Taser itself, right?
I'm not sure if it's a requirement of owning it, but it is a requirement of us going through instructor training.
Okay, got it. Now, you also teach in use of Tasers and use of force of the various statutes from Minnesota, do you not?
I do.
And I've looked at your training materials, and one of the statutes referenced is Minnesota Statute 609.06. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's the statute that permits reasonable force to be used towards an individual under certain circumstances. Isn't that right?
Of an officer and other people in the state of Minnesota, yes.
But it's designed to give some clarity to what an officer can do vis-a-vis a reasonable force.
Correct.
And it gives criteria or examples of what can be used in reasonable force by the officer, right?
Yes.
And you teach this,
Yes.
almost with your eyes closed,
Depending on the day.
after all these years.
Yeah.
And the statute says that reasonable force may be used towards a person without the other's consent when the following circumstances exist or the actor reasonably believes them to exist. And the circumstances include, for a police officer at least, in effectuating a lawful arrest. Correct?
Yes.
In the execution of legal process.
Yes.
In the enforcement of an order for the court. Is that correct?
Correct.
Such as a bench warrant.
Yes.
or in executing any other duty imposed by the public officer by law. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you can use reasonable force to make an arrest if
Yes.
the circumstances permit, correct?
Yes.
Objection has to answer.
The objection is overruled. I'll let the answer stand.
And you can use reasonable force to enforce an order of the court.
Yes.
A bench warrant is an order of the court, right?
Yes.
Directing you as a police officer to make an arrest of the individual.
Correct.
I mean, a judge has directed you to do that.
Yes.
And as a part of your obligations as a police officer, you're to honor that bench warrant.
Yes.
You just can't close your eyes to it.
No.
And then there are criteria according to your outlines, which I've read too, on the factors to be considered when you judge what a reasonable force should be used. And one of the factors is the threat, the possible threat of the arrestee, right?
Correct.
How fast it occurs.
Yes.
Whether the arrestee is high or impaired.
Yes.
The seriousness of the offense.
Yes.
By the way, is fleeing a police officer a felony in Minnesota
It depends how they're fleeing.
in a car?
That is a felony.
Is it in Minnesota a dangerous offense in your view?
Objection, Your Honor, foundation.
The objection is sustained.
Well, does fleeing a police officer at a high rate of speed suggest to you a certain amount of dangerousness?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance and foundation.
Well, the objection is overruled. You may answer that.
Can you repeat?
Well, does fleeing an officer in a car at a high rate of speed suggest to you a certain amount of dangerousness?
Yes.
And why is that?
It puts the person driving that car, the officer, and the general public at risk in their attempts to evade the officer.
And the public's at risk because, as you've seen in your career, the individual fleeing a police officer can crash.
Yes.
Often does.
Frequently.
Kill somebody.
Can.
And that's why it's so dangerous.
Yes.
And it's important in making an arrest to prevent that sort of thing from happening.
Yes.
That's your obligation as a police officer, right?
Correct.
Now, you also teach another statute on the use of deadly force. I know you're here for Taser, but I want to ask you a couple questions about it. All right?
Sure.
And that statute 609.066, is that right?
Correct.
And that permits the officer to use deadly force under certain circumstances. Okay?
Correct.
And you teach this.
We do.
The circumstances involve an apparent risk of if there's an apparent risk of great bodily harm or death
Yes.
to the officer herself or
Yes.
himself, right?
Yes.
To the other officers on the scene
Correct.
or the community nearby.
Correct.
And if there is an apparent threat of death or great bodily harm, deadly force can be used to prevent an escape or facilitate the capture.
Can you repeat?
If there is an apparent risk of great bodily harm, can deadly force under this statute be used to effectuate an arrest or prevent an escape?
Yes.
And when you evaluate the use of a deadly force, you teach that it's a decision that's made right there and then.
Correct.
It's not the subject of hindsight.
Correct.
It's not whether someone would have done something differently after the fact.
Correct.
It's not the subject of 20/20 vision.
Correct.
And it's a decision that's made under rapidly evolving circumstance, right?
Yes.
That's right out of Graham versus Connor, which you teach too.
Correct.
And finally, the decision is made at the very moment the force is used. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's what was known to the officer at that moment.
Correct.
You also teach that the stressors involved in critical incidents, as you mentioned, vary from officer to officer, right?
Could you repeat that?
The stressors vary from officer to officer.
Correct.
One officer may freeze, for example.
Hopefully not.
You hope you train not to, right?
Correct.
You train action.
Yes.
You train make a decision
Yes.
at the spur of the moment.
Yes.
Even if it's the wrong one, you make a decision.
Yes.
Because if you wait, that can be deathly too.
For multiple people.
Now, you have not, in your capacity as a witness, seen any of the videos in this case, I think, right?
Only small snippets months ago.
All right. So, in fact, you haven't wanted to because you knew you were going to testify as a trainer.
Correct.
Okay. So you didn't want that to be in your brain, so to speak.
Correct.
And you knew it, once you saw it, it wouldn't leave you.
Yes.
Because you knew everybody here. You knew everybody in the video.
Very well.
Now, but you do teach officers that, you know, where there's a warrant for a gun charge, they should make the arrest. Am I correct? If there's a bench warrant.
Can you say that again?
Where the suspect has a bench warrant for a gun charge, they should make an arrest.
Yes.
They can't let him go.
No.
You also teach that when a gun is involved on a bench warrant, that the officer should be vigilant about another gun being in the car at issue,
Absolutely.
or a gun being on the person. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you train this over and over again, right?
Yes.
Because stopping someone in a car is one of the most dangerous things you can do.
Yes.
And police officers who aren't vigilant and are not aware of the dangers can be shot.
Yes.
Have been
Yes.
in Minnesota.
Yes.
Just because a gun isn't found later in the car at issue doesn't mean the officer's interest in or belief a gun is there is invalid, though.
Objection, relevance.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
You want me to repeat that?
Please do.
Just because a gun isn't found doesn't mean to you that the officer's interest or belief a gun may be in the car is invalid.
It would not be invalid.
And just because the arrestee doesn't have a gun on his person, the officer is still reasonable in his belief or her belief that a gun may be there, or a gun would have been there, or could have been there.
They'd be reasonable in that belief, yes.
And you also teach during all these lessons that you have is that there are certain community interests in play in making arrests.
Yes.
And one of the interests in the community is the safety of all the innocent citizens, right?
Correct?
Of course, it is to prevent harm to the officers.
Yes.
That's a community interest.
Yes.
It's to ensure public safety.
Yes.
It's to ensure a driver who's not supposed to drive doesn't drive anymore.
Yes.
I mean, you got to have a license to drive.
In the state of Minnesota, yes.
It's unsafe to drive without one.
Yes.
It's unsafe to drive without insurance,
Yes.
because that's a requirement too, right?
Of the state, yes.
And another community interest is to validate court orders, right?
Yes.
If a guy's not supposed to be on the street, he's got to get off the street.
If that's what the court said, yes.
Is the use of a taser a form of de-escalation, in your view?
Yes.
Meaning that instead of, it can de-escalate the situation by incapacitating the defendant or the suspect, right?
Or other ways, yes.
So you're taught to use the taser to de-escalate a situation. Fair?
Yes.
You're also taught, you also teach that you can't always predict the arrestee's behavior.
Correct.
Now, I want you to, I know you haven't seen the video, but I want to give you a hypothetical and ask whether the use of the taser would have been appropriate, okay?
Okay.
Let's suppose that an individual's driving a car. He is stopped for legitimate reason. Let us further suppose that when asked for a license, the individual doesn't have a license. He doesn't have any identification. There's no insurance current on the car. Let's further assume that the individual has a bench warrant for a gun charge. And let's assume further that there's an order for protection against him, and then there's a female in the car, and a female is listed on the order for protection. Okay? And let's assume further that when the individual police officer in my scenario tells the individual to get out of the car and tells him further that he's under arrest, and the individual resists arrest. And the individual is told by another officer on the scene, I'll tase you, I'll tase you. The individual climbs back in the car that's stationary, but attempts to engage the car. It is not moving. Under those circumstances that I've outlined for you, would it be reasonable for an officer to fire a taser to stop this individual?
Your Honor, I'm going to object on calls for speculation, foundation.
The objection is overruled, and you may answer.
If that
It's stroking out. All right, give me a second. See if I can refresh
You
it.
also teach, I've got just a couple more questions for you. I appreciate your answers. You also teach that mistakes can happen in police work.
Objection, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
mistakes can happen in every part of our world.
Accidents can happen.
But the audio is working.
Yes.
They're part, no matter how hard you train, no matter how hours you put into it, policing and living is a human endeavor.
There are too many variables to have planned out in advance to be able to eliminate that forever.
And we're all engaging in the endeavor of living imperfectly.
Correct.
But when someone, like a police officer, yells out, "Taser, taser, taser," and shouts at a suspect, does that indicate to you that a taser is about to be used?
Yes.
You've known Officer Potter for 15 years.
If not longer.
And you're familiar with her character and reputation in the community.
Yes.
I mean, you've watched her, worked with her. It's a close-knit community, right?
Yes.
Does she have a reputation in your community for being peaceful?
Objection, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled.
Can you repeat?
Pardon me?
Can you repeat?
Does she have a reputation in your community for being peaceful, or having the trait of being peaceful?
Yes.
Peacefulness. Does she have a reputation in your community for having the character trait of being law-abiding?
Yes.
Yes, she does. May I have a moment?
Yes.
Surprised they haven't taken a 20-minute break yet.
All right. Redirect, Mr. Frank.
I thought I called it there for a second.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Sergeant Peterson, for coming back again this morning. You were
They're running their life like shit.
It's not part of the curriculum, but when officers do things in training that may not be what they wanted, we retrain that. So I would classify that as being an accident. It's not something that they wanted to have happen.
And then you would correct that? You would address that?
Yep. During our debrief, we would talk about what they didn't like about it, and then give them an opportunity to put a positive training scenario conclusion into their brain.
During this training on March 2nd of this year, you did this scenario and with the bat, correct?
Correct.
And you said nobody shot you with a gun, right?
Not for that specific part of the training.
And did anybody draw their gun, saying that they actually meant to draw their taser?
I do not recall.
And I think, well, in that scenario, as with all scenarios, they know they're being assessed, correct?
Yes.
And they're being assessed on whether their behavior is in accordance with reasonable expectations of the department about how an officer should react in situations.
Based on state law and policy and court cases, yes.
You were asked about driving without a license and driving without insurance. You have any idea of how many times you've stopped people on duty in Minnesota that did not have a license?
Objection beyond the scope.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
How many times I have stopped somebody without a license while working as a police officer?
Correct.
That's the question? Hundreds.
And how many times have you stopped people and found out they did not have insurance?
Hundreds.
Do you recall, how many times in those hundreds and hundreds of those stops they were driving unsafely?
I didn't hear the last word.
That the drivers that you stopped had been driving unsafely.
That'd be really hard for me to put a number on over a 16-year career.
I'm trying to figure out. Oh, sorry. So I'm trying to figure out, what it is about not having insurance that means they're an unsafe driver.
It would depend on the driver, I guess. I mean, there'd be specific circumstances for that stop, but generally, I have seen that people who don't have a license and insurance don't follow the rules of the road the way people who do have a license and have insurance do.
So when you're stopping somebody, you don't know if they have the fact of insurance alone doesn't make them unsafe.
No, and that's not something I know before the stop.
You were asked about de-escalation, correct?
Yes.
And de-escalation is, in fact, something you teach as part of the training of officers in Brooklyn Center.
It's something we teach and our profession has done for decades.
And, in fact, it's mandated by post, isn't it?
Recently, yes.
And part of that A through F that we looked at the other day, part of the post mandates.
Yes.
And so using a taser, you indicated, is one way of de-escalating a situation, correct?
It can be.
And it can also, however, could it, increase the risk to others in the area. The risk of harm, I should say.
That's a really general statement for me to be able to answer.
Well, you answered, that it can be used to de-escalate,
Yes,
and that's by incapacitating the person, correct?
yes,
And so that then brings down the activity, shall we say, of the subject,
okay,
right? Is that what you meant by incapacitating?
yes,
And by incapacitating that person, that could have foreseeable effects as well for others.
again, it could depending on those specific circumstances.
Yeah. So incapacitating a driver, you don't want to do if they're operating the vehicle.
If the vehicle is in motion, correct.
And a vehicle that can be put into motion at that moment, is that really any less, in your opinion, is it less of a risk?
It would very much depend on the circumstances.
And you are not familiar with the exact circumstances of this incident, correct?
I am not.
You have not done any interviews of witnesses
No,
and not gone out and viewed anything more than just the couple of snippets that you referenced.
not intentionally.
And by not intentionally, you mean
Those snippets.
you saw those just,
The news was on, and by the time I turned the channel, I had seen part of it.
okay. And you talked about, or you were asked about stopping the car. Stopping a car is a dangerous situation, correct?
Correct.
Not all stops are dangerous, but it is a dangerous situation for officers, right?
One of the higher dangers, yes.
And is that one reason why officers will often stop when another officer already has a vehicle stopped to provide backup?
Yes.
Does the presence of more than one officer help with ensuring the safety of the officer and others?
It should, yes.
And that's the whole point of backup, right?
Correct.
You were asked a couple times about well, let me back up to the situation involving the vehicle. When whether a vehicle is moving or stationary, an officer has to consider, when using force, the presence of other occupants in that vehicle, right?
Yes.
And you were asked this hypothetical, and what I want to ask you about is when assessing whether to pursue somebody that you have stopped and is trying to get away, is one factor for the officer to consider when using force whether that person has been identified and could probably be found later.
That is one of many factors.
You were asked about the term hindsight, correct?
Yes.
And that's in your training materials?
Over the years, yes.
And what does that mean to you?
It means that the incident will not be judged by anybody with information that was collected after that incident.
And so that determination of the reasonableness of the officer's force, if I understand what you're saying, is not based on things the officer didn't know at the time.
Correct.
You also talked about the language about 20/20 vision. What do you mean by that? What is your understanding of that term?
It's similar to that hindsight, that information not known at the time of the incident to the officers on scene cannot be used to determine the reasonableness of that force.
Do you know if those terms are actually in the statute about force, authorized use of force?
In statute?
Correct.
They're not in statute, but they're in case law.
And you accept the proposition that here in court the judge will give the jurors instructions on what the law is to apply here.
Yes.
You were asked several times about a warrant authorizing an officer to make an arrest, correct?
Correct.
And you were asked, that means they have to arrest them, correct? You recall being asked that?
Yes, depending on the warrant.
And does it, in fact, in all circumstances, require that officer to make a custodial arrest at that moment because of the warrant?
A custodial arrest where the person is placed into jail, not all warrants require that.
Okay, fair enough. In executing a warrant, making an arrest, as you were asked about earlier, officers still have to determine the amount of force that they will use to make that arrest.
Correct.
And a warrant still requires that an officer use reasonable force to make the arrest, correct?
Yes.
And if an officer determines that they cannot safely make that arrest, safety for themselves or others, that's a decision they can make, correct?
That being only one of many criteria.
Sure. So they have, while there is a court order, they have some discretion on how they make that arrest on that warrant.
Some. In determining whether an officer can use force on an occupant of a vehicle, you've drawn a distinction between the vehicle moving and not moving, correct? Correct.
Does the officer have to take into consideration the ability of a person to put that vehicle in motion?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay. So if you have an occupant of a vehicle, stationary, but the occupant is in the driver's seat, the engine running, foot in the floorboards, does an officer have to decide, take into consideration at least, whether that person has the ability to then move that vehicle?
In fractions of a second, yes.
Why do you say that?
Because life happens really fast in force incidents.
So it would depend on the circumstances of that situation.
Correct.
But it is something to take into consideration.
Yes.
Because if the person, if an officer used force on that individual and they were able to put the vehicle in motion, would you have the same kind of concerns in that situation as your other scenario where the vehicle is already in motion?
It would depend on the type of force that was applied at that time.
Okay,
And then-
to the person driving the vehicle.
Correct.
Is it dangerous to incapacitate a person who's operating a vehicle when it's moving?
It can be in short durations.
And, okay. Incidentally, you were asked about confusions. You indicated there have been cases of confusions of a taser and a handgun.
Correct.
Do you know how many there have been?
I do not.
When you testified yesterday about proficiency, remember I asked you how you define that. And does proficiency include training to know the feel of a taser?
It's not something that we specifically discuss.
And in your training, your policy requires that officers perform draws of the taser so that they become proficient at doing so.
Yes.
And so that is done as part of the training?
Yes.
Have you ever drawn your handgun when you meant to draw your taser?
Not that I recall, no.
You testified during cross-examination that the use of force often has to be arrived at the decision in a short amount of time, correct?
Yes.
And the scenarios that you have been running with your officers for 8, 9, 10 years, that's an aspect of those scenario trainings as well, making them happen quickly.
Yes.
You're familiar with this, well, let me ask you this. The Taser 7, you were asked about the transition course. Did the previous model of the Taser 7, or the Taser that you used was X26P, correct?
Correct.
And was that also yellow?
Ours were yes.
And did it have a safety switch?
Yes.
Did it have the CID display in the back of it?
It did?
Did it have at least one laser and a flashlight?
Yes.
Was there anything different about the basic function of the Taser 7 from the XP26 in terms of drawing it and deploying it?
The basic function, no.
The spark test that was in policy existed, or that requirement was in policy as well with regard to the X26P, the previous model.
Yes.
And Mr. Eng told you what should means, but is it expected that officers will follow that part of the policy to perform a spark function test?
As much as possible, yes.
Well, what would make it impossible to do?
If as soon as we got into roll call, the shooting came out and we had to run out to go render aid.
And so it would be that kind of circumstance that would excuse an officer from doing the spark test?
Immediate call for service, yes.
What is the purpose of the spark function test?
It depends on the model.
Well, for purposes of the Taser 7, what is the purpose?
To ensure that there are no major faults with it and that it's going to operate when the officer needs to use it on the street.
And so to assure that somebody who's working with you and is going to deploy their taser for a good reason, you want to make sure that that happens, correct?
Yes.
You want to make sure their taser is working,
Correct.
and if you're going to deploy your taser at that moment when you have to, you want to make sure it's going to work.
Yes.
And so, would a good officer do that every shift?
Yes.
Have you done scenario-based training where the scenarios involve the stop of a motor vehicle?
Yes.
In fact, I think some of them refer to high-risk stops, correct?
That's a different type of vehicular stop, yes.
Okay, why? What makes it that?
Circumstances of that stop would have us not approach the vehicle. We'd wait until there's additional squads there, more than just two, and we would call the people out of the vehicle back towards us rather than us going up towards the vehicle.
So a much different structured or approach to the vehicle.
Correct.
But you have done regular vehicle stops in your scenario training?
Yes.
And in some of those have the role players that are the driver of the vehicle attempted to flee.
I don't recall.
Is that a possibility that was done in scenarios?
Certainly is a possibility.
Is something officers would need to be, well, is that something officers would need to be prepared to handle out on the road?
Yeah. Yes.
And when you're doing those scenarios, do officers have on them gun, taser, baton, every tool that they can use when they're out in the street?
Inert training devices, as many as we can and that we're allowed to afford. That's what we employ during our training sessions.
When you are training on firearms and qualification for firearms, do you have to train, or do you train that officers must consider backdrop?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
That means that you are paying attention to the things that would be beyond your target in case a round did not strike your intended target, so that we would not inflict collateral damage.
And is that something officers have to take into consideration when using their firearm?
Yes.
Do they have to take that into consideration when using a taser?
Yes.
If I could just have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, that's all I have. Thank you.
Fine. Recross, Mr. Ng, you may proceed.
A couple more questions. You were asked whether a good officer would do a spark test.
I was asked that.
Well, a good officer might miss a spark test too.
They certainly
You
could.
can be a good officer and miss this occasionally.
Correct.
It's not the criteria you would use to judge a good officer.
Not in and of itself, no.
And the question of insurance, I mean, well, you'd look at the bulk of a career, for example, wouldn't you?
Can you say that
To
again?
judge whether an officer's good or not, you'd look at the bulk of a career too, wouldn't you?
Yes.
The body of her work, right?
Yes.
A person who drives with insurance, you indicated, has a little more difficulty with the law. Would you explain that?
I'm going to check, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled. You may answer if you can.
Do you remember the question?
Can you repeat it?
Sure. Well, you were asked on direct about insurance, and you indicated that when an individual has insurance, there is more of a proclivity to have problems, so to speak. I'm paraphrasing your answer.
When they do not have insurance,
Yeah.
they're more unsafe on the roads.
Yeah. Why'd you say that?
One of the primary duties of a police officer is to ensure traffic safety, to prevent crashes, to prevent people from driving under the influence. In my career, I have stopped people that have been not safe in their driving to meet those goals, and during those investigations, many times I have led to those people not having insurance.
And the lack of insurance harms the community.
Yes,
Because if there's a crash, there's no recovery by the automobile that doesn't have insurance,
correct,
which is the function of insurance to begin with.
correct.
And in fact, when you apply for a license on a car, you have to indicate the insurance company that covers the car, right?
I'm not aware what the requirements are to get a driver's license.
Now, when you apply for tabs, for example, do you have to say that you're insured?
Currently, the state has put that requirement in, yes.
And that's to ensure public safety, right?
I would believe so.
Now, you were asked some questions about cars and if a car is about to drive away. What the criteria you use is a control of the car. Control is the operative word you use in your training. Is that right?
Yes,
And you draw a distinction between a stationary car and one car that's in movement. Is that right?
correct.
Because that's all an officer can see.
Yes,
And you've had instances in your career where you attempt to make sure that the individual doesn't drive away from you. Is that right?
in my career,
Yeah.
yes.
So that the individual is prevented from taking control over the car.
Yes,
The issue of a warrant, you were asked about speeding tickets and arresting people on speeding tickets. Do you draw a distinction between an arrest warrant for a gun charge and a speeding ticket?
yes,
And when you make an arrest on a warrant, the first thing you do is cuff. Is that correct?
when I make an arrest,
Yeah.
after telling them they're under arrest, yes, that would be to cuff them.
And then once you cuff them, you put them in your car.
Correct,
And then you figure out what you're going to do.
correct.
Now, in the scenario that I gave you on the use of tasers, one more fact that I want you to consider, one more hypothetical fact. Suppose further that a police officer is inside the car and the driver is attempting to leave, and the officer is, the door to the passenger side is open, and the officer is seen inside the car. Would a taser be appropriate to be used to stop the individual from leaving?
Where is the officer?
The passenger side, the passenger seat,
In an open door or a closed
open
door?
door.
And they're in the interior of the vehicle.
Yes.
And your question about that scenario for this is?
Should that individual be stopped?
Yes.
Mr. Wright, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will try to be brief. The additional facts added to the hypothetical, is it part of training that it is dangerous for officers to put themselves inside of a vehicle when a suspect is trying to flee?
It's something that we want to try and avoid, but it's not always avoidable.
And if an officer determines that they can do that and stop the fleeing by rendering the vehicle inoperable, shutting it off, putting it in park, that would be a decision for an officer to make. Could be one decision they could make.
Yes.
So just because, well, let me ask it this way. If an officer, there is a danger that an officer could get dragged by a fleeing person, correct?
It is a danger.
And officers are trained on that danger.
Yes.
And but the mere presence of the officer to some extent into the vehicle is a determination an officer has to, is a fact an officer has to consider when deciding whether that officer is in danger of being dragged.
In any rapidly unfolding incident, there are many factors that officers have to make, and they have to make those decisions in a very short amount of time.
And so the answer is that is a consideration for them.
Of many.
And the officers that you have trained for Brooklyn Center would know that it's dangerous to place themselves in a position where they would be in a vehicle that could be.
Foundation.
The objection is sustained.
Well, I asked, well, is it part of your training then that officers should not put them in a position like that in a vehicle?
We do not deal in absolutes because no incident in this world is ever forecasted. We give recommendations. We give officers as many hypotheticals as we can, but the world is constantly moving and evolving. It's something that we warn on, but it's that officer's determination at that time in that specific incident that is different than any other incident that they've probably been in to make that decision.
Fair enough. And so what you're saying is it all would depend on where that officer is, where their feet are, where they're located physically, if they're outside the door. It's going to depend on a lot of considerations.
It would depend on their actions, the actions of officers, and the actions of any suspects or any other people inside that vehicle.
But in terms of reasonable force by that officer, it's from that officer's perspective.
That specific officer's perspective, what their actions are.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Bean.
During one of these critical incidences, all the officers are expected to help each other.
Can you,
During these instances where there's a decision that has to be made quickly, all the officers are there to help each other.
so you're not speaking about a specific incident, but the
No.
things that we do on a daily basis.
You're there to help your other officers.
Correct.
Anything further from the stage?
Oh, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. Thank you. You may step down. Okay, members of the jury, we're going to take our morning break. Okay?
Thank you so much, Cassandra, for your donation and your support. I really appreciate you. Well, I just got a notification that my Instagram has been hacked, so that's something fun I'll have to deal with when I'm not live anymore. So the reason we were not live yesterday is because I was notified that the city is going to impound my other vehicle that I have sitting with no plates and no insurance because I have a new vehicle. And so I had to set up to have it scrapped because I don't have enough time to sell it off. So that's why I was not live yesterday. Hopefully today they come and scrap it. No, hydrodynamic. I'm pretty sure my Instagram was just hacked. I'm gonna have to deal with it. They were trying to. I just tried to do a password reset. The phone number they suggested I've never seen before. The email they suggested is also something I've never seen before. So I'm pretty sure something I'll have to deal with. V-Dog, it's a 2002 Chevy Trailblazer. Yeah, it's just been like one thing after another the last like 2 weeks. It is what it is. Berserker, I live in an apartment complex, and so they don't like that I have 2 vehicles. It's a long story. It's a long story. Where I live is very poor, and so any kind of way they can make money, they will go ahead and have that done. I wonder how long this trial is going to go. Seems like it's just going on and on forever. These questions mean nothing. Shink, I don't know if I could donate it or not. It needs some work. It needs a new battery. Well, I put a $2,400 differential on it because it seized up while I was going down the street. And then I drove it for another 2 weeks. And then I went and got a new car because I had saved up and I wanted to get one anyways. And so I parked my Trailblazer. I was going to get it cleaned out and take it to the car wash and stuff, and then put it online and sell it. And I had one thing after another.
If you're trying to lose belly fat, stop doing cardio. This sounds kind of backwards, right? Well, believe me, it's
in case you want to do cardio. Anyways, it kept getting pushed back. I went out there to start it, and I couldn't turn the key. The ignition wouldn't turn. Then I realized I couldn't unlock the doors. Couldn't use the headlights, couldn't turn on the radio, and something happened and it put my Trailblazer in security mode. And it killed the battery when that happened too. And so I put another battery in it thinking that would fix it. Nope, that didn't fix it. Google don't know what's wrong. The mechanics don't know what's wrong. And yeah, they're like, oh yeah, just take it to the dealership and give them $5,000 to pull your car out of the security mode because it thinks it's being stolen. And to hell with that, I'm just going to scrap it. There's nothing I can do about it. I think they're only going to give me $200 for it, which sucks, but I don't know. I live alone. I'm starting to have more problems than I can handle by myself, so they're just going to have to come scrap it. There's nothing I can do about it. Maina, I guess I exercise a little bit. I don't know if I've really been going ham exercising, but I exercise a little bit. VDub, I've thought about putting it up on the like Facebook Marketplace and saying all that, but it only blue books at like $1,100. And I don't know if people are gonna. I don't. It's more about time. It's not really about convincing others to get it. It's more about I don't have the time. I don't have the time to deal with it. Salty Ragu, they have to access the chip because I have a code reader and I could just reset the codes and stuff, but the problem is you can't turn the key forward. It's in security mode, so it has pins that go into the cylinder that prevents the key from turning in the ignition, and because you can't turn the key forward, you can't access the code. It's dumb. It's dumb. The whole thing is dumb. It's just a big issue that I'm dealing with. Berserker, you guys will hear me freestyle sometime, but it ain't gonna be today. Sell it on Odyssey. Hydrodynamic, I have tried unplugging the battery. I've tried having the battery plugged in with the key in the door, held in the unlock position. I've had it with all the doors closed, key in the ignition for longer than 20 minutes, trying to get the security lights in the vehicle to turn off. There's something that happens when you connect the battery that it looks like the hazards are on for like maybe a minute or two, and while that's happening, like the lights will flash, the doors function, the radio functions, everything functions. But then as soon as the headlights stop flashing, it goes back into security mode. There's just no way for me to get. I've tried everything that the internet suggests. I'm not sure how much a new ignition switch is. I don't think it's too much. I would have to replace the cylinder and get a new key for it. But I don't necessarily know that will work because I don't know what caused it to seize up. I don't know. I just need time to mess with it, and I don't have enough. There's not enough daylight for me to mess with it because I'm covering the trial and stuff, and I don't have no one to help me. I just got to get rid of it. I don't have time or the energy or the help to fix it. I have to just get rid of it. I would just set it on fire if I could just legally do that. What's up, Josh? I'm doing all right. I hope you are too. Yeah, this trial is just dragging on. It is dragging on and on and on. Salty Ragu, I called the tow truck people because they're connected to a mechanic that I go to, and they said they don't know what's wrong with it. I told them everything that was going on, and all they said was to take it to the dealership, and I'm not willing to put any more money into it. Use it for target practice. I'm pretty sure it's a crime to shoot a car, even for target practice. Pretty sure you can't do that. And I live in town, so I mean it's probably really illegal for me to do it. It'd be different if I lived in the sticks. All right, I'll check it out, V-Dub. I need something. I need something, sir. Yeah, the tow truck is supposed to call me sometime this afternoon. I'm hoping it's going to be on the lunch break. Otherwise, I'll have to deal with it during the live. I don't know. Something I'll have to deal with today. It most definitely is the flux capacitor. Absolutely, that's got to be what it is. Yeah, Faded Operator, I've spent so much money on this Trailblazer. I bought it for $900 a couple years ago, and it had a gas leak. But then I found out it was the fuel pump and the fuel lines, and that was $600 to fix. And then the front brakes, the calipers, disassembled while I was on the road, and my brakes fell out on the ground while I was driving. That was $600 to fix. And then my AC pump went, and my fan assembly and all that went, and that was $500 to fix. And then my differential went, and that was $2,400 to fix. And then my rear window on the driver's side stopped working. My rear brakes stopped working. And then it went into security mode, and I don't have any more to give to it. My relationship with my Trailblazer is just about as toxic as the government. It's just, I can't give any more to it. I've given all I have to give. Hydrodynamic. I just put a new battery in it after 2 weeks of it sitting with a dead battery. I can't figure out anything that's causing those issues. Yeah, Stacy, I don't know. I just spent $6,000 on a Subaru, and now I got problems with that. And it's like, I don't know. I just hate cars. I hate cars and everything connected to them. Yeah, I don't know if that Trailblazer's cursed, but it's rough. I know that. It is rough. Rough stuff. I think here in Michigan we're having like a used car issue. People are selling cars here that have 250,000 miles on them and bad tires, and the car hardly works, and only 2 gears shift, and this, that, and the other. They want $7,500 for it. It's crazy. It's real crazy the way that they are selling cars around here. Buy a horse, they eat grass. Yeah, I guess I'll park my horse in the parking lot. Dr. Time, yeah, I actually have to pull the battery before they show up. So I'm thinking for the lunch break I'll have to go down there and pull the battery out. And it sucks because it's under a harness and a battery cover and all this other stuff. So I live stream during the day, and then I'm a mechanic in the afternoon. I wear many hats. Secretary's dead. No. Everything on it is stock as far as I know. Yeah, Stacy, it could be. I don't know. They're gonna have to lower those prices of those vehicles. They want us all to convert over to electric cars. Don't set batteries on concrete. I don't. No, it's not sitting on concrete. Why not though? I've never heard that. Why? Yeah, Newton, I would like to have a Toyota Tundra. My grandpa had one before he died. I got to drive it and it was super nice. My grandpa only drove Toyotas. Good Lord, Stacy. Don't set the battery or your women on the concrete. Got it. I have to write that down so I don't forget. Cost you $400 to put a battery in your truck? I think this battery was like $60 at Walmart. I'm taking it back today after I get off the live. Mark, anyone who has spent the night or week in the drunk tank knows the concrete will drain you. It won't make you blow zeros though, not unless you do some push-ups and sit-ups while you're in there. Just saying, just, you know, kind of speculating here, sort of, a little bit from past experiences. Anyways. Secretary's dad, do you think it's a bad module? It could be. It definitely could be. I wish I could turn the key forward so I would be able to tell if there's any codes or anything going on, but I just want to be done with it. That's a pretty good deal, Matt. Trying to think. I got a 2009 Subaru Outback. It's got like 95,000 miles on it. I paid $6,000 for it. Yeah, Jeb, my Subaru is crazy. You have to click the gas cap 5 times for it to be considered sealed, and I didn't know that, and so I put gas in it for the first time and, you know, clicked it 2 or 3 times, closed the thing. All of a sudden my cruise control disarmed itself, my traction control disarmed itself, the engine light came on, and something else happened. And I thought the whole car was taking a shit, and I looked it up, and I guess anytime your engine light comes on, it disables all these features. And I found out the reason the engine light came on was because I didn't click my gas cap 5 times. So yeah, the more technology we have, the dumber everything in life seems to be. Kev chat. No, it's a V6.
Thanks.
She's got that special drink. She's been hanging out with Pelosi. Salty Ragu at 1, Corinne. Okay, Corinne didn't come mess with the Trailblazer. She's been hanging out with Trigger Crazy.
Okay, please be seated. The state may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state would call Professor Seth Stoughton.
Professor, good morning. Will you please come forward and then stand behind the witness chair, which is right next to me. Raise your right hand. Do you swear under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully testify in connection with this case?
I do.
Please have a seat. And would you please remove your mask
They had to put a muzzle on him because he bites.
and state your full name and spell it?
My name is Seth Wayne Stoughton, SETHWAYNE STOUGHTON.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're testifying. The court reporter that's sitting right in front of you is taking down everything that's being said. Therefore, you have to answer with a yes or a no instead of shaking your head, and don't say uh-huh or uh-uh.
I understand.
All right. Only one person can talk at a time. Wait until the question's finished.
My apologies, everyone. Actually, let me flip the screen really quick.
An objection is made. You've got to stop.
I just got a text message from the scrapyard. They're coming to get my Trailblazer. I have to go downstairs and pull my battery out of the car. It's going to take me like a half hour, and then I don't know how long it's going to take to deal with them. I have to cut the live off. I can't trust that they're not going to show pew-pews on the screen or anything while I'm gone. Otherwise, I would just let it be and let you guys see it. I can't trust it, and I can't risk my channel over that. We will be live again. I don't know if I'll be back before lunch break starts, but we will go live after the lunch break if I'm not able to come back quick enough. I'm sorry, everyone. This is not something I want to deal with. This is just something I have to deal with. I am sorry, and we will be back. My apologies to all of you, and we will get the Pledge of Allegiance in and everything. Yeah, hope to see you guys in the next live. Until then, stand tall, shine bright, and that's a wrap.